This is a brief PowerPoint presentation on Sigmund Freud, so you can get sort of a quick refresher on his theories relevant to child development. Despite accusation debunking his theory and character, no one can ever doubt the impact that Sigmund Freud had on this field of psychology and psychoanalysis. Even though his ideas were dependent on case studies which were widely misread, even though his view on people's sexual obsession was more supportive of his own personal desires, the way we look at sexuality and sexual development today was because of his willingness to approach the subject head-on. Many have questioned his scientific studies and even his ethics, but his ideas are still the basis in which we understand the human mind and the unconscious. The purpose of introducing them here is not to validate any of his theories. I'm hardly trained in psychology, and my approach is purely on the lit-crit side. For a great portion of my graduate work was in the German Studies department at the University of California at Santa Barbara, in which I was indoctrinated with Freudian's criticism. Though I never bought into his religion, I did see the amusement of using Freudian psychoanalysis in literary theory, and thus I want to do a brief run-through of his theories, since a majority of his ideas arise in the literary analysis of children's literature, for better or worse. Incidentally, the most popular photographs of Sigmund Freud is always him holding a cigar. A lot of phallic humor is played off here, but Freud was also addicted to cigars, which led him to developing cancer in the mouth later in life. So here's a brief rundown of the 5 stages of his psychoanalysis, and I will go through each individually. Again, take this with a grain of salt. I'm not trying to sell you anything. This is only for background knowledge, though I'm sure a lot of you can find some kernel of truth in his observations. Okay, so let's start with the first stage, which is called the oral stage. And one can see where Freud gets this part of his theory. Baby sucking is sucking his thumb and therefore has an oral fixation. I think a major concern here is the idea that this is tied to some way with sexuality, that the boy enjoys this in a sexual manner. It is one of comfort and security for sure, and nothing more. However, one of the worries that parents have is whether the thumb sucking would affect the gaps in their teeth, not any sexual hang-ups. Incidentally, there will be a German tale that we'll read in this class about thumb sucking, and there's even a castration image in the story itself, but we'll get there when we get there. The next stage every parent should be familiar with, is the anal stage. It's the moment of potty training. Freud links this stage to the moment where the child first faces discipline for the first time. This is something he's created, his shit, to his parents, who find it disgusting, so disgusting in fact they flush it down the toilet. Although I know some parents who celebrate the first time their child is aware of them defecating. What I find fascinating here is that, and I'll start to follow along with Freud, is how accurate he gets of the ages. Usually most toddlers who are potty trained is by the 3rd year, and my son was potty trained exactly at 35 months. So I give Freud some kudos to that observation. Now is a good time to mention Freud is writing these theories on child development based on the proper progression of straight children, in particular straight boys. He does have reservations on gay children as they develop, which he calls as abnormal. But one can see already a flaw in his ideas. Nevertheless, he's more in tune with the science of sexual behavior, gay or straight, than anyone before him, especially with the church doctrines which dealt with sexuality poorly at the time. I'll focus here on the boys as well, since the most important part of this stage is the Oedipal complex. He does suggest that girls go through an Electra complex, but this is pretty much ignored in Freudian psychoanalysis. The Oedipal complex remains a popular theme not only in children's literature, but with the many works of adult themes, again, concerning the male identity. And presumably there is this stage in man's development where sex doesn't happen. Freud calls this the latency period, and conveniently coincides this with the child's formal entry into the public education system. If you go onto that link, you'll see a scene from Annie Hall by Woody Allen. So finally, if all goes well, if we grow up all naturally, according to Freud, we'll outgrow this Oedipalness in ourselves and become normal, healthy sexual beings with no hang-ups, no sexual problems, all in perfect relationships. Then this is where Freud loses me again. In any case, the theory shows a transition that should happen, creating a normalcy that children should transition to. Now you may disregard Freud in favor of Eric Erikson and a more contemporary theorist of child behavior, but one obviously is much more current to the sensitivity of sexual awakening. However, hopefully you'll have a general understanding of Freudian theory and see how it is played out in the analysis that we'll do with the text of children's literature. It's just another insight, another tool to use when critiquing these literary works.